A black man was arrested on the street without any valid reason. Two police officers thought it was just a routine stop until they uncovered a shocking truth about his identity. The entire police department was left in utter disbelief, and the community erupted in outrage. What lies behind this extraordinary event? And how could a wrongful arrest lead to a seismic shift in the system? The story ahead will captivate you from start to finish. Thank you for watching. If you love emotionally stirring and meaningful stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and join us for more impactful journeys. In the heart of the city, the morning sun began to rise, casting long shadows over towering skyscrapers. The sounds of car horns, distant sirens, and snippets of conversation filled the air. People bustled about, starting their day, grabbing coffee, rushing to work, or walking their dogs. The entire neighborhood buzzed with life, brimming with energy. Amid the bustling crowd, Daniel Wright walked calmly, a stark contrast to the hurried pace surrounding him. In his mid-30s, Daniel was dressed in a meticulously tailored suit, his polished leather shoes tapping rhythmically against the pavement. A faint smile graced his lips as he adjusted the cuffs of his crisp white shirt. His presence naturally drew attention, not because he sought it, but due to the quiet confidence he exuded. He was the kind of person people turned to look at, without him making any effort to stand out. Daniel had just finished breakfast at his usual diner, where the staff knew him by name and always prepared his favorite order: scrambled eggs, turkey bacon, and a side of fresh fruit. As he approached his car, a sleek black sedan parked on the street, he felt his phone vibrate in his pocket. Pulling it out, he saw a text from his mother, reminding him about the family dinner that evening. Daniel smiled as he typed a quick response, assuring her that he remembered and was looking forward to it. Family meant everything to him. Just as Daniel was about to unlock his car, he noticed two police officers walking toward him. Their eyes were fixed on him, their expressions cold and unreadable. Daniel didn't recognize them. They were likely new to the area, but what stood out was the icy intensity in their gazes. As a black man, Daniel had been taught by his father from a young age how to interact with police. Remain calm, be respectful, and avoid giving them any reason to escalate the situation. Those lessons were deeply ingrained in him. "Excuse me, sir," one of the officers said as they approached. Daniel stopped, turning to face them with his phone still in hand. "Yes, officer," he replied, his voice steady and polite. He noted the nameplate on the officer's uniform, Riley. The other officer, Jenkins, stood slightly behind, his hand resting near his waist, close to his holstered gun. "Can we see some ID?" Riley asked, his tone sharp, bordering on commanding. There was no greeting, no explanation for their approach. Daniel was no stranger to situations like this, but something about this encounter felt different. The air was heavy with tension, signaling that something was off. "May I ask why?" Daniel inquired, his tone calm. He didn't want to escalate the situation but knew his rights. He hadn't done anything wrong and saw no reason for them to ask for his identification. Riley's eyes narrowed, his mouth curling into a slight smirk, almost mocking. "It's just a simple request, sir. Go ahead and hand it over." Daniel held Riley's gaze for a moment before slowly reaching into his jacket pocket for his wallet. "All right," he said, handing over his driver's license. "But I'd still like to know why you're asking." Riley took the ID, his expression remaining unchanged. "What are you doing in this area?" Riley asked, his tone laced with suspicion. Daniel frowned slightly, puzzled. "I'm just heading to my car," he replied. "Is there a problem?" Riley ignored the question. "Where are you coming from?" "I had breakfast at the diner down the street," Daniel answered evenly. "As I said, is there an issue, officer?" Riley's gaze flicked up, locking with Daniel's. For a brief moment, something flickered in his eyes. Irritation, perhaps. Riley handed back the ID with a smug look. "We received reports of suspicious activity in the area," he said, a half smile playing on his lips. "You match the description of someone we're looking for." Daniel's stomach tightened. He knew exactly where this was going. It was a story he'd heard too many times before. A black man in a well-to-do neighborhood, dressed sharply, must surely be up to no good. Though familiar, the narrative never became less infuriating. I see, Daniel responded carefully. There must be some misunderstanding. I'm just here to get my car and head to work. Riley stepped closer, his stance becoming visibly more menacing. What kind of work do you do? I'm an attorney, Daniel replied, his tone calm and measured. I have a meeting in an hour, so unless there's anything else, I'd like to be on my way. The answer caught Riley off guard. His mocking smile faltered briefly before quickly returning. An attorney? That's impressive. At that moment, Jenkins, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke. You're sure you're not hiding anything? Got anything illegal in your car? The tension in the air thickened. Daniel was acutely aware of how situations like this could spiral out of control. He needed to stay calm, to find a way to de-escalate the encounter. There's nothing illegal in my car, officer, Daniel said, his voice steady. You're welcome to check, but I think it would just waste your time. I'm only trying to get to work. Riley's expression turned icy. You don't get to decide how we do our job. Step away from the vehicle. Daniel hesitated. He knew he hadn't done anything wrong, but the situation was rapidly becoming perilous. He had to choose. Cooperate and hope it didn't escalate. Further, or stand his ground and risk the consequences. His father's voice echoed in his mind, reminding him to stay calm and act wisely. All right, Daniel said slowly, raising his hands to show he wasn't a threat. I'll step back. He took a step away from his car, and that was when Riley moved in, his hand gripping the holstered gun. Daniel's heart pounded, but his face remained composed. He couldn't let them see his fear. Without warning, Riley grabbed Daniel's arm and twisted it behind his back. The sudden movement left Daniel stunned, a sharp pain shooting through his shoulder. Before he could respond, Jenkins was on him, forcing him to the ground. Hey, what are you doing? Daniel protested, his voice strained as he fought to stay composed despite the pain. He didn't resist, but the officers treated him as if he were a dangerous criminal. You're under arrest for resisting an officer, Riley said coldly, snapping handcuffs onto Daniel's wrists with deliberate force. Daniel's mind raced. Resisting, he had done everything they asked. He had explained, stayed calm and complied, yet it had all been in vain. They had judged him guilty the moment they saw him. The commotion began to draw attention. Agnes Carter, an elderly woman who lived in an apartment across the street, stood on her balcony, her face etched with horror. She knew Daniel. She had seen him in the neighborhood many times and knew he wasn't a troublemaker. What are you doing to him? She shouted, her voice trembling with indignation. He hasn't done anything wrong. A young couple walking their dog stopped and stared. The man pulled out his phone and began recording. This is ridiculous, he muttered to his girlfriend. They're arresting him for no reason. Daniel caught sight of the phone filming the scene. For a fleeting moment, a glimmer of hope flickered within him. Maybe this video would help later. Maybe it would show the world the truth. But right now he was powerless. The officers hauled Daniel to his feet. He forced himself to remain calm, focused. He knew that anything he said could be twisted against him. As they led him toward the patrol car, the crowd grew larger. More people stopped, some filming, others shouting their disapproval at the officers. This isn't right, a man called out from across the street. He didn't do anything wrong, but Riley and Jenkins ignored them. Their faces remained stoic, resolute. They shoved Daniel into the back seat of the patrol car and slammed the door shut. Before the car began to move, Daniel turned his head, looking out the window. His eyes met the faces of the crowd, angry, worried, and confused. He took a deep breath, knowing he had to say something, even if it was just a few words. This isn't over, he said firmly, his voice cutting through the thin glass. This isn't over. Daniel's words hung in the air as the police car pulled away, leaving a stunned crowd behind. Inside the car, his mind churned with thoughts of what would come next, how he would fight back and ensure that justice prevailed. The police station was a stark contrast to the bustling streets outside. The cold, gray walls, Harsh fluorescent lights and constant hum of activity created an oppressive atmosphere. Officers moved briskly through the corridors. Some engaged in quiet conversations, others focused intently on their tasks. Though busy, the station carried an undercurrent of tension, where whispers were the norm, and everyone seemed to glance over their shoulder. Daniel Wright was escorted through the main entrance, his hands still cuffed behind his back. Flanking him were officers Riley and Jenkins, their faces unreadable. As they passed through the reception area, a few officers glanced up, their eyes briefly assessing Daniel, a sharply dressed black man, calm yet clearly out of place in this setting. "Bring him over here," Riley barked, shoving Daniel toward a desk where a weary-looking officer sat behind a computer. The officer glanced up momentarily before returning to the screen, his expression disinterested. "Name?" the officer asked, fingers poised over the keyboard. "Daniel Wright," Riley answered before Daniel could speak. The officer entered the name into the system, his eyes scanning the screen. His brow furrowed slightly, but he said nothing, motioning for Riley to take Daniel to the fingerprinting area. "Let's get this over with," Riley muttered, pushing Daniel forward. Daniel didn't resist. He knew better than to do anything that might escalate the situation further. As they fingerprinted him, he remained silent, his mind racing. He couldn't believe this was happening. He had done nothing wrong, yet he was being treated like a criminal. Still, he knew he had to stay calm and think clearly. This wasn't the first time he'd faced a situation like this, and he doubted it would be the last. After the fingerprinting process, Riley and Jenkins led Daniel to a small holding cell at the far end of the station. The cramped space held a metal bench along one wall and a steel toilet in the corner. The air was thick with the smell of disinfectant, mingled with an unpleasant sour odor. They uncuffed him and shoved him inside. "Get comfortable," Jenkins sneered, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You might be here for a while." Daniel sat down on the bench, taking a deep breath. He didn't respond to the provocation. There was no point. He knew they wanted to rile him up, to provoke a reaction, but he wouldn't give them the satisfaction. Riley and Jenkins walked away, exchanging a glance that seemed to hold some unspoken agreement. They likely felt they'd done their job, locking up another troublemaker. Now they could move on to their next task. But something about the arrest gnawed at Riley. The way Daniel had maintained his composure, the quiet confidence he exuded, it didn't align with the image of the people he typically arrested. "He said he's a lawyer?" Jenkins mocked as they approached the reception desk. "Probably just a con artist in a fancy suit." "Yeah," Riley mumbled, but his mind was elsewhere. Doubts began to creep in. There was something about Daniel that didn't sit right with him, though he couldn't put his finger on it. Riley shook his head, trying to dismiss the unease. It didn't matter. They had followed procedure, and that was all that counted. As they returned to the reception desk, a young officer stepped forward. His name was Reed, a rookie who had been with the department for only a few months. Eager to prove himself, Reed was not only hardworking but also sharper than most people gave him credit for. "Riley," Reed called out in a low voice. "Can I talk to you for a moment?" Riley frowned, glancing at Reed with suspicion. "What is it?" Reed hesitated, scanning the room to ensure no one was listening. "The man you just brought in, Daniel Wright. I think I know who he is." Riley's frown deepened. "What are you talking about?" Reed stepped closer, lowering his voice to a near whisper. "I saw him in an article a few weeks ago." "He's not just a lawyer," Reed said, his voice calm but deliberate. "He's a civil rights attorney, and a pretty high-profile one at that. He's been involved in some major cases, ones that have made headlines." Riley's eyes widened slightly before he quickly masked his surprise. "You're sure about this?" "Absolutely," Reed replied. "At first, I didn't recognize him, but when I heard his name, it clicked. You might want to tread carefully with this guy. If he's who I think he is, this could turn into a PR nightmare for us." Riley didn't respond immediately. A wave of unease began to rise in him, but he pushed it aside. This couldn't be true. They had detained him legally. There was no reason this man could be someone important. Yet doubt crept in, unsettling him. "I'll handle it," Riley said curtly, signaling for Reed to leave. But as he turned away, the sense of unease lingered, gnawing at the edges of his confidence. Reed watched Riley walk off before pulling out his phone. Scrolling through his contacts, he found the number he needed. Taking a deep breath, he hit call. The line rang twice before a deep voice answered. "Hello, Captain, this is Reed," he said, keeping his voice low. "We have a situation at the station. I think you should know about it." Meanwhile, in the holding cell, Daniel sat in silence, his mind focused. He understood that this situation wasn't just about him. It was part of a larger issue, a reflection of systemic problems. He knew he had been targeted, though the exact reason remained unclear. Even so, Daniel maintained his composure, refusing to let fear take hold. He had endured worse in the past and was confident he could get through this. An hour passed. The heavy door to the holding area swung open, and a woman entered. She appeared to be in her late 30s, with sharp eyes and an authoritative presence that commanded immediate respect. This was Lieutenant Rachel Carter, recently transferred to the precinct. Though she had only been there for a few weeks, she had already established herself as someone not to be underestimated. Carter's gaze swept across the room, observing the officers at work. She noticed Riley and Jenkins talking in hushed tones by the reception desk. Something about their demeanor caught her attention. Over the years, she had learned to trust her instincts, and right now they told her something was amiss. "Riley, Jenkins," she called out, striding toward them. Riley looked up, startled to see her. "Everything's fine, Lieutenant. Just another routine day." Carter narrowed her eyes. "Is that so? Because I heard you brought someone in this morning. A man named Daniel Wright." Riley stiffened slightly but quickly regained his composure. "That's correct, Lieutenant. We did. What are the charges?" she asked, her voice calm but probing. Resisting an officer, Riley replied confidently. "We had reason to believe he was involved in suspicious activity. When we questioned him, he refused to cooperate." Carter raised an eyebrow. "Is that right?" Riley nodded. "Yes, ma'am. That's correct." Carter didn't respond immediately. Instead, she stared at Riley, scrutinizing him as though searching for any sign of dishonesty. She had worked with officers like Riley before, men who believed they could bend the rules to suit their purposes. But Carter was different. She had built her career on integrity, following the law to the letter, and she demanded the same from her team. "Take me to him," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. Riley hesitated for a moment before nodding. "This way, Lieutenant." The confrontation as they reached Daniel's cell, Lieutenant Rachel Carter stopped, her eyes fixed on the man inside. Daniel sat calmly on the metal bench, his hands resting on his knees. Despite the uncomfortable circumstances, his demeanor was composed, almost resolute. Something about him made Carter pause. "Is this him?" she asked, turning to Riley. "Yes, Lieutenant," Riley confirmed. "As I said, he resisted arrest, so we had no choice but to detain him." Carter didn't respond immediately. She opened the cell door and stepped inside. Daniel looked up, his eyes meeting hers. Steady, calm, and unwavering. There was no hint of fear, nor any defiance. He simply exuded quiet confidence. "Mr. Wright," Carter began, her voice measured. "I'm Lieutenant Rachel Carter. I'm here to ask you a few questions." "Of course, Lieutenant," Daniel replied courteously. "I'm happy to cooperate." Carter nodded, taking in his composed tone. "I've been informed that you resisted arrest, which led to your detainment. I'd like to hear your version of events." Daniel held her gaze, his voice even as he spoke. "Lieutenant, I did no such thing. I complied with every directive given by Officers Riley and Jenkins. I was walking to my car when they stopped me. When I asked why I was being detained, a simple question escalated the situation. Before I knew it, I was handcuffed and accused of resisting." Carter listened carefully, her eyes narrowing slightly as she processed his words. There was something in his voice, calm, measured, but firm, that suggested he was telling the truth. She turned to Riley, who stood a few steps away, his posture tense but his face attempting to appear neutral. Is what he's saying true, Riley? Carter asked sharply. Did Mr. Wright comply with your instructions? Riley shifted uncomfortably. Well, Lieutenant, he did question us and the situation became tense. We believed he might have been hiding something. Carter's gaze hardened. And what specifically gave you that impression? Riley hesitated, unable to provide a solid answer. It was just a feeling, Lieutenant, he muttered, his voice trailing off. A feeling? Carter repeated incredulously. That's the basis for his arrest? Riley opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, the sound of the holding area door opening drew everyone's attention. They turned to see Officer Reed entering, slightly out of breath. He froze for a moment, realizing he had walked into a tense scene. Lieutenant, I need to speak with you, Reed said quickly, his eyes darting between Daniel and Riley. Carter cast one last piercing look at Riley before stepping out of the cell and closing the door behind her. What is it, Reed? Reed lowered his voice, clearly trying to keep the conversation private. Lieutenant, I did some digging. Daniel Wright isn't just any lawyer. He's a prominent civil rights attorney, known for taking on high-profile cases that have made headlines. If word gets out that we detained him without just cause, this could be catastrophic. Carter's unease deepened. She had suspected the situation wasn't straightforward, but learning about Daniel's prominence escalated the stakes significantly. You're certain? Absolutely, Reed replied, holding out his phone. On the screen was Daniel's profile from a reputable legal website. This is him. If we don't handle this carefully, we're not just looking at an internal investigation, we could be facing a much larger crisis. Carter quickly scanned the information, her eyes widening as she absorbed the details of Daniel's career. He wasn't just a lawyer. He was a formidable figure in the legal world, someone who had gone up against police departments, major corporations, and even government agencies. He was the kind of man who could turn this entire precinct upside down if they mishandled the situation. Carter took a deep breath, her mind racing as she considered her options. This was no longer just about procedural correctness. It was about preventing a full-scale public relations disaster. We need to get ahead of this, she said firmly. Bring me everything you have on his arrest, body cam footage, reports, witness statements. I want it all on my desk within the hour. Reed nodded. Understood, Lieutenant. As he hurried off, Carter glanced back toward the holding cell, where Daniel sat, still calm and composed. She had a sinking feeling that this was just the beginning of a much larger storm. Riley, she called out, her voice sharp and authoritative. My office. Now. Riley hesitated, but the look on her face left no room for argument. He followed her down the hall, his unease growing with each step. Carter knew one thing for certain. This situation was far from over. Lieutenant Rachel Carter turned her sharp gaze toward Riley and Jenkins, both of whom were visibly growing more anxious. She knew she needed to act quickly. Things were deteriorating fast. Riley, Jenkins, Carter barked, striding purposefully toward them. We need to talk now. The two officers exchanged uneasy glances before silently following her into a private room within the station. Once there, Carter turned to face them, her eyes cold and piercing. Do you have any idea who you've just arrested? She asked, her voice low but brimming with authority. Daniel Wright is not some random passerby. He's a prominent civil rights attorney, known for taking on cases involving police misconduct. If he decides to sue, we are going to face significant trouble. Riley's face paled, the confidence he had exuded earlier now crumbling. Lieutenant, he didn't mention he was a lawyer. That doesn't matter, Carter snapped. It was your responsibility to investigate before making an arrest. Now we need to contain this situation, and fast. At that moment, loud chants from outside the station echoed through the walls. Carter froze, her stomach sinking as realization dawned. The crowd outside was growing, their voices louder and angrier. She could clearly make out chants for justice and demands to release Daniel Wright. Perfect, Carter muttered under her breath, the weight of the situation pressing heavily on her shoulders. Officer Reed stepped forward, his face tense with urgency. Lieutenant, the community is fired up. Activists, local leaders, Even a few reporters are gathering outside. If we don't act quickly, this is going to turn into a full-blown crisis." Carter nodded grimly. She had seen minor incidents spiral into major events simply because they weren't handled properly. But this wasn't just about managing tensions. It was about protecting the department's reputation and avoiding a legal and public relations catastrophe. "We need to get ahead of this," Carter said firmly. She turned back to Riley and Jenkins. "Riley, Jenkins, I want a complete report on this arrest. Every step you took and the reasoning behind it. I don't care how long it takes. Get it done." Then she addressed Reed. "Reed, I need you to help me craft a strategy for handling the media. We need to control the narrative before this spirals any further." The officers hurried to carry out her orders, leaving Carter to grapple with the enormity of the situation. Though she had only been with the precinct for a few weeks, she now found herself at the center of a potential disaster. Still, she refused to let this derail her career or tarnish the department's reputation. In the holding cell, Daniel sat quietly, his mind racing. He could hear the escalating noise from outside, chants and shouts that reverberated throughout the station. He knew his family and supporters would be among those gathered, demanding his release. Despite the chaos, Daniel remained calm. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about shining a light on systemic injustice. Daniel knew the community leaders and activists who stood by him wouldn't let this incident go unanswered. A flicker of hope ignited in his chest, but he tempered it with caution. The police still held the power to manipulate the situation, and he had seen similar scenarios before. He couldn't underestimate them. Tensions outside the station continued to escalate. The crowd had swelled to over 100 people, many holding signs demanding justice for Daniel Wright. Reporters with cameras captured every moment, ensuring that the station had become the epicenter of the community's growing frustration. Inside, Carter stood by the front window, her jaw clenched in frustration as she observed the scene. She knew she had to act, but this was a delicate situation. One wrong move, and the situation could explode. Yet inaction would only make things worse. Turning to Reed, who stood nearby, she spoke with quiet determination. "We have to release him," she said, her voice laced with tension. "It's the only way to defuse this." Reed nodded in agreement. "But how do we explain this to the media? They won't easily accept us releasing him without a solid explanation." Carter paused for a moment, her expression thoughtful before responding. "We'll frame it as a misunderstanding. Say that upon reviewing the evidence, we found no grounds for detainment and decided to release him. Emphasize that we take matters like these very seriously and remain committed to justice and fairness. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was the best they could do under the circumstances. If they were fortunate, it would be enough to calm the crowd and prevent further escalation." Carter knew it wouldn't be easy, but she had no other choice. She had to think about the bigger picture, the department's reputation, her own career, and the potential fallout if they mishandled this situation. Carter moved away from the window and headed toward the holding area, determined to resolve the situation before it spiraled further out of control. As she passed Riley and Jenkins, who were furiously typing up reports, she stopped and fixed them with an icy stare. "When this is over, we're going to have a serious conversation about what happened here," she said coldly, "and I guarantee it won't be pleasant." Riley swallowed hard, nodding silently. He knew he had created a significant mess, but there was nothing he could do now except hope Carter could clean it up. When Carter reached Daniel's cell, she unlocked the door herself, stepping inside with deliberate composure. "Mr. Wright, I've reviewed the situation, and it's clear this was a misunderstanding. You're free to go." Daniel rose slowly, his expression cautious. "A misunderstanding? Lieutenant, you're calling this a misunderstanding?" Carter met his gaze without flinching. "Yes, I am, and I sincerely apologize for what has happened today. This situation should never have gone this far." Daniel stared at her, his sharp eyes searching for any hint of insincerity. After a moment, he nodded. "I appreciate your apology, Lieutenant, but you should know this isn't over." Carter didn't doubt it. She knew Daniel Wright wasn't someone who would let this slide easily. Her priority now, however, was ensuring his safe release and defusing the tension outside. Carter escorted Daniel out of the holding area, passing officers who avoided his gaze, their tension palpable. When they reached the front doors of the station, Carter paused, taking a deep breath. "I'll do everything in my power to make this right," she said quietly. Daniel nodded but remained silent. He stepped outside, greeted by the deafening cheers of the crowd. Camera flashes lit up the night, and reporters shouted his name, bombarding him with questions. Daniel ignored them, walking calmly toward his waiting family and friends. He embraced his loved ones, a quiet moment of relief amid the chaos. From the station's doorway, Carter watched, her face unreadable. She knew this was just the beginning. Daniel Wright wouldn't let this matter die quietly, and the repercussions of today's events would be felt for a long time. At least for now, the immediate crisis had been diffused. The crowd began to disperse, reporters packed up their equipment, and the tense atmosphere inside the station started to ease. Daniel left the police station knowing this was only the start of a new fight. He had been wronged, but he also knew what needed to be done to correct it. Daniel resolved to turn this injustice into a force for change. The truth would come out, and when it did, the police department and the town would never be the same. Inside the station, the tension lingered long after Daniel had walked out the doors. Lieutenant Rachel Carter couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. Sitting in her office, she reviewed the preliminary reports from Riley and Jenkins. Her mind, however, kept returning to the image of the man they had detained, and the storm that was sure to follow Lieutenant Rachel Carter couldn't shake the image of Daniel Wright sitting calmly in his cell. The quiet confidence he exuded, as though waiting for something inevitable, gnawed at her. Her instincts told her there was more to this story than met the eye, and she never ignored her instincts. Years in law enforcement had taught her that when things didn't add up, there was always a hidden truth waiting to be uncovered. The world outside her office was a stark contrast to the stillness within. Officers moved with palpable tension, avoiding eye contact with one another. Though the crowd outside had mostly dispersed, the damage was done. No one believed the situation would simply fade away. Leaning back in her chair, Carter stared at the ceiling, her thoughts racing. She knew she had to dig deeper to understand who Daniel Wright really was and why his arrest had triggered such an explosive reaction. Pulling her laptop closer, she began typing quickly. The search results stunned her. Articles, news clips, and interviews painted a picture of a man far beyond a typical attorney. Daniel Wright was a symbol in the civil rights movement, a lawyer who had gone toe-to-toe with some of the most powerful institutions in the country. He had won landmark cases that had changed lives and policies, affecting thousands. As Carter delved further, her eyes narrowed on one particular case. A massive lawsuit Wright had recently won against another police department in a neighboring city. The case had exposed deep-seated corruption, resulting in multiple officers being fired and some even facing criminal charges. It was a landmark victory for Wright and his team, but it also made him a target for law enforcement agencies nationwide. As she continued digging, Carter stumbled upon a chilling detail. Daniel Wright had been involved in a federal investigation into systemic racism within law enforcement. That investigation had already placed several police departments under federal oversight, with rumors swirling that others were being scrutinized. Carter's pulse quickened as the implications sank in. She quickly picked up her phone and called a trusted contact within the FBI, careful not to reveal too much and escalate the situation further. The conversation was brief but confirmed her worst fears. Daniel Wright was covertly working to gather evidence for a federal case that could potentially dismantle multiple law enforcement agencies, including her own. Sitting back in her chair, Carter felt the weight of the situation settle heavily on her shoulders. This wasn't just a simple mistake. Daniel Wright hadn't been in the wrong place at the wrong time, he was a target. Riley and Jenkins had unknowingly stepped into a highly sensitive operation. If word of this leaked, it would be a scandal of monumental proportions. Carter knew she needed to confront Riley and Jenkins, but first, she had to arm herself with more information. For the next hour, she combed through every detail she could find about Daniel Wright's work, his connections, and the ongoing federal investigation. The more she uncovered, the clearer it became that this was far more dangerous than she had initially thought. Finally, Carter stood, taking a deep breath. She was about to walk into a storm, but there was no other option. She couldn't allow her precinct to be destroyed because of someone else's recklessness. Striding into the main work area, Carter made a beeline for Riley and Jenkins. The two officers were focused on typing up their reports, but immediately looked up when they saw her approach. The tension in her posture was unmistakable. "Lieutenant," Riley said cautiously, "is something wrong?" Carter crossed her arms, her icy gaze fixed on them. "We need to talk, now." The two exchanged uneasy glances before silently following her into an empty conference room. Carter shut the door behind them, and the atmosphere immediately grew heavy. "What's this about, Lieutenant?" Jenkins asked, trying to sound calm, but his nervousness was evident. Carter didn't mince words. "I know who Daniel Wright is." Riley's eyes widened, and Jenkins froze. Neither said a word, but Carter saw the panic flash across their faces. They had no idea who they had crossed, and now that realization was beginning to dawn on them. "Do you have any idea how much trouble you've caused?" she said, her voice low but sharp as a blade. "Lieutenant, we didn't know," Riley stammered, his earlier confidence crumbling. "That's the problem," Carter snapped. "You didn't know because you didn't bother to find out. Daniel Wright isn't just some random lawyer. He's a prominent civil rights attorney, involved in federal investigations that could bring down entire police departments, including ours." Jenkins swallowed hard, his composure slipping. "We didn't mean," "You didn't mean?" Carter interrupted, her tone cutting. "Do you think that's going to matter when this blows up in our faces? Do you think anyone will care about your intentions when this precinct becomes the center of a national scandal?" The room fell silent, the weight of her words sinking in. Carter paced the room, her mind racing. "This is bigger than the two of you," she said finally. "Right now, our only priority is damage control. I want every detail about what happened during that arrest, from start to finish, on my desk within the hour. No omissions, no excuses." "Yes, ma'am," Jenkins mumbled, his face pale. Carter turned to leave but paused at the door. "And let me be clear, this isn't over. Once this is contained, we're going to have a serious conversation about your future in this department." Without waiting for a response, she exited the room, leaving the two officers in stunned silence. Back in her office, Carter sat down, her thoughts a whirlwind of possibilities. She knew that dealing with Daniel Wright wasn't just about mitigating a PR disaster, it was about ensuring that justice was done, even if it came at a personal cost. As she stared at the case files in front of her, Carter knew one thing for certain. The events of today were only the beginning of a much larger battle. "Daniel Wright isn't just a civil rights attorney," Carter said, her voice calm but razor sharp. "He's a federal asset, working undercover to gather evidence of corruption within police forces, evidence that could implicate this precinct." Riley's face turned ashen, all color draining from his features. "We didn't know, Lieutenant," he stammered. "He didn't say anything about being undercover. We thought he was just what?" Carter interrupted, her tone slicing through the air like a whip. "Just a black man you thought you could intimidate without consequences?" Jenkins lowered his head, avoiding her gaze, while Riley opened his mouth to respond but found no words. Carter could see the dawning realization on their faces, the weight of what they had done pressing heavily on their shoulders. "You two have put us all in jeopardy," she said, her voice steady but laden with gravity. "Not just the precinct, but the entire city. If this investigation comes to light, we're all going down with it." Riley finally found his voice. "Lieutenant, we didn't know. We were just following procedure." "Procedure?" Carter snapped, her voice rising. "What procedure? Arresting a man without probable cause and treating him like a criminal? Now, we're at the center of a federal investigation that could destroy everything we've built." Jenkins looked like he might collapse under the pressure. "What do we do now, Lieutenant?" Before Carter could respond, the conference room door burst open. Police Chief George Baker stormed in, his face flushed with anger, his eyes blazing as he scanned the room.
Lieutenant Carter,
he bellowed, his voice echoing off the walls. What the hell is going on here? Carter stood her ground, meeting Baker's fiery gaze without flinching. Sir, we have a serious problem. Daniel Wright is... I know exactly who Daniel Wright is, Baker interrupted, his tone dripping with disdain. And I know exactly how much of a mess you people have created. Carter blinked, momentarily taken aback by the interruption. Sir, I don't... Baker thundered. Do you have any idea what kind of situation you've put this precinct in? A civil rights attorney working undercover in our city, and you've handed him all the evidence he needs to take us down. This is a disaster, and it's on you. Carter's jaw tightened. With all due respect, Chief, the blame doesn't rest solely on me. Officers Riley and Jenkins conducted the arrest without proper cause, and now we're all paying the price. Baker's glare shifted to Riley and Jenkins, his expression hard as steel. I'll deal with them later. Right now, we need to focus on damage control. Carter nodded, forcing herself to stay calm. I've started gathering information. There's an active federal investigation into systemic racism in law enforcement, and it's tied to recent federal oversight of local police departments. Daniel Wright is collecting evidence for that investigation. If we don't handle this carefully, everything will collapse. Baker took a deep breath, his anger simmering but contained. What's our next move? Before Carter could respond, a knock on the door interrupted them. A young officer poked his head in, looking visibly uneasy. Chief, Lieutenant, someone is here to see you. He says it's urgent. Baker frowned. Who is it? A federal agent. Name's Luke. The room fell into a heavy silence as the words settled. Carter and Baker exchanged tense glances. This was the moment they had feared. Send him in, Baker ordered, his voice taut. The officer nodded and disappeared into the hallway. Moments later, the door opened again, and Special Agent Luke Bennett entered the room. Tall and imposing, Bennett carried himself with an air of authority that commanded immediate respect. His tailored black suit was immaculate, and the gleaming badge on his belt caught the light of the fluorescent bulbs overhead. Chief Baker, Lieutenant Carter, Bennett greeted curtly, his sharp eyes sweeping across the room. We need to talk. Baker straightened, his posture stiff as he tried to maintain control of the situation. Agent Bennett, I'm sure we can explain. There's nothing to explain, Chief, Bennett interrupted, his tone clipped and uncompromising. We've been monitoring this precinct for months, and today's events have escalated things to a critical level. Carter felt her stomach drop. She had suspected they were under scrutiny, but hearing it confirmed was like a punch to the gut. Agent Bennett, she began, her tone measured, I assure you, we are fully committed to cooperating with your investigation. Bennett's sharp gaze shifted to her. Lieutenant, this isn't about cooperation. This is about accountability. Daniel Wright's arrest was a monumental mistake, one that has jeopardized months of work and endangered lives. Now, we need to clean up the mess you've made. Baker bristled at the rebuke but managed to hold his tongue. What do you need from us, Agent Bennett? He asked, his tone begrudgingly conciliatory. Bennett pulled a folder from his briefcase and placed it on the table. First, I need access to all documentation related to today's arrest, reports, body cam footage, everything. Second, you will suspend Officers Riley and Jenkins effective immediately, pending further investigation. Carter glanced at Riley and Jenkins, who looked as though they might protest, but a glare from Baker silenced them. And finally, Bennett continued, I need assurances that this precinct will fully cooperate moving forward. No more missteps, no more excuses. Baker nodded stiffly. You have my word. As Agent Bennett left the room, Carter sat back in her chair, the weight of the day crashing down on her. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The federal investigation was now front and center, and the repercussions would ripple through the entire department. Baker turned to Carter, his expression grim. Fix this, he ordered, and don't let it happen again. Carter nodded, already planning her next steps. There was no room for error now. Luke raised a hand, silencing the room. There's no need to explain, Chief Baker. I'm fully aware of what happened here. Let me be clear. This is an extremely serious matter. Carter felt her pulse quicken as Luke's steely gaze swept across the room. His tone left no doubt about the gravity of the situation. Daniel Wright is a key asset in an ongoing federal investigation, Luke continued, his voice steady and uncompromising. An investigation that has been meticulously built over months. His arrest was a mistake that could have widespread repercussions if not handled properly. Baker shifted uncomfortably, nodding slowly. We understand that, Agent Luke. We're prepared to cooperate fully. Good, Luke replied curtly. Because at this point, your cooperation is the only thing preventing this situation from escalating further. Carter absorbed the weight of his words. This was no longer just about Daniel Wright. It was about the police department, the city, and the fragile balance of an ongoing federal operation. One misstep and everything could collapse. Luke's expression hardened as his gaze lingered on each officer in the room. You will issue a formal apology on behalf of the department. Any resistance to this directive will result in immediate and decisive action. Baker's face flushed with anger, but he nodded reluctantly. Understood. Turning to Carter, Luke's eyes sharpened. Now it's time to start cleaning up the mess. Daniel Wright isn't just a civil rights attorney, Carter said, her voice calm but piercing. He's a federal asset, working undercover to gather evidence of corruption within law enforcement, evidence that could implicate this precinct. Riley turned pale, his face drained of all color. We didn't know, Lieutenant, he stammered. He didn't say anything about being undercover. We thought he was just what? Carter interrupted, her voice icy and cutting. Just a black man you thought you could bully without consequences? Jenkins hung his head, avoiding her gaze, while Riley opened his mouth as if to respond, but no words came. Carter could see the dawning realization. On their faces, the weight of their actions pressing heavily on them. You two have jeopardized all of us, she said, her voice low but heavy with gravity. Not just the department, but the entire city. If this investigation goes public, we'll all go down with it. Riley finally managed to speak. Lieutenant, we didn't know. We were just following protocol. Protocol? Carter snapped, her voice rising. What protocol? Arresting a man without probable cause, treating him like a criminal? And now, we're at the center of a federal investigation that could destroy everything we've worked for. Jenkins looked as though he might crumble under the pressure. What do we do now, Lieutenant? Before Carter could answer, the conference room door slammed open. Chief George Baker stormed in, his face flushed red with rage, his eyes blazing as he scanned the room.
Lieutenant Carter,
he bellowed, his voice echoing off the walls. What the hell is going on here? Carter straightened, locking eyes with Baker's fury. Sir, we have a serious problem. Daniel Wright is... I know exactly who Daniel Wright is, Baker interrupted, his tone laced with disdain. And I know exactly how badly you people have screwed this. Carter blinked, momentarily thrown by the interruption. Sir, I don't... Baker snapped. Do you have any idea what kind of situation you've put this department in? A civil rights attorney working undercover in our city, and you've handed him all the evidence he needs to bring us down. This is a disaster, and it's your fault. Carter's jaw tightened. With all due respect, Chief, the blame doesn't rest solely on me. Officers Riley and Jenkins made the arrest without proper cause, and now we're all paying the price. Baker's glare shifted to Riley and Jenkins, his expression as hard as stone. I'll deal with them later. Right now, we need to focus on damage control. Carter nodded, forcing herself to remain composed. I've already started gathering information. There's an active federal investigation into systemic racism within law enforcement, tied to recent federal oversight of local police departments. Daniel Wright is collecting evidence for that investigation. If we don't tread carefully, everything will fall apart. Baker took a deep breath, his fury simmering just beneath the surface. What's our next move? Before Carter could respond, a knock came at the door. A young officer poked his head in, his face lined with worry. Chief, Lieutenant, someone is here to see you. He says it's urgent. Baker frowned. Who is it? A federal agent. Name's Luke. The room fell silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Carter and Baker exchanged grim looks. This was the moment they had feared. "Send him in," Baker ordered, his voice tight. The officer nodded and disappeared into the hallway. Moments later, the door opened again, and Special Agent Luke Bennett entered the room. Tall and imposing, Bennett carried an air of authority that demanded immediate attention. His impeccably tailored black suit and gleaming badge reflected the fluorescent light, his presence radiating quiet power. "Chief Baker." "Lieutenant Carter," Luke greeted briskly, his sharp eyes scanning the room. "We need to talk." Baker straightened, his posture rigid as he tried to maintain control. "Agent Bennett, I'm sure we can explain." "There's nothing to explain, Chief," Bennett interrupted, his tone clipped and unyielding. "We've been monitoring this precinct for months, and today's events have escalated things to a critical level." Carter felt the weight of the day settle heavily on her shoulders. The federal investigation was no longer a distant threat. It was here, and it was unavoidable. She knew that any further missteps could be catastrophic, not just for her department but for the entire city. As Baker struggled to respond, Bennett's gaze landed on Carter. "Lieutenant, I trust you'll ensure that there are no further surprises." "Yes, Agent Bennett," Carter said, her voice steady despite the storm raging around her. Bennett nodded once before leaving the room, his presence lingering like a shadow. As the door closed behind him, Baker turned to Carter, his face a mixture of fury and defeat. "Fix this," he ordered, his voice low and dangerous. "And don't let it happen again." Carter nodded, her resolve hardening. The fight was far from over, but she was determined to see it through. Carter nodded, forcing herself to remain composed. "I've already begun assessing the situation. There's an ongoing federal investigation into systemic racism in law enforcement, tied to recent federal oversight of local police departments. Daniel Wright is gathering evidence for that investigation. If we don't handle this carefully, everything could collapse." Baker took a deep breath, suppressing his anger as he worked to maintain control. "What's our next move?" Before Carter could answer, a knock interrupted the tense conversation. A young officer peeked in, his face tense with worry. "Chief, Lieutenant, someone is here to see you. He says it's urgent." Baker frowned. "Who is it?" "A federal agent. Name's Luke." The room fell silent as the weight of those words sunk in. Carter and Baker exchanged uneasy glances. This was the moment they had feared. "Send him in," Baker ordered, his voice tight. The officer nodded and disappeared down the hall. Moments later, the door opened, and Special Agent Luke Bennett entered the room. Tall and commanding, Bennett's presence was impossible to ignore. His impeccably tailored black suit and the gleaming badge on his belt caught the fluorescent light, reflecting his air of unshakable authority. "Chief Baker." "Lieutenant Carter," Luke greeted curtly, his sharp gaze sweeping the room. "We need to talk." Baker stood straighter, attempting to maintain control of the situation. "Agent Bennett, I'm sure we can explain." Luke raised a hand, cutting him off. "There's no need to explain, Chief Baker. I'm fully aware of what happened here. Let me make one thing clear. This is a very serious matter." Carter's heartbeat quickened as she watched Luke, his tone leaving no room for doubt about the gravity of the situation. "Daniel Wright is a key figure in a federal investigation," Luke continued, his voice steady but unyielding. "An investigation that has been meticulously built over months. Arresting him was a mistake with far-reaching consequences if not handled correctly." Baker shifted uncomfortably, nodding slowly. "We understand that, Agent Luke. We're prepared to cooperate fully." "Good," Luke replied bluntly, "because right now your cooperation is the only thing preventing this situation from escalating further." Carter absorbed the enormity of what was unfolding. This wasn't just about Daniel Wright anymore. This was about the department, the city, and the fragile threads holding the situation together. One misstep and it could all unravel. Luke's gaze hardened as it swept the room. "You will issue a formal apology on behalf of the department. Any resistance to this directive will result in immediate and decisive action." Baker's face reddened with restrained anger, but he nodded reluctantly. Understood. Luke turned to Carter, his eyes sharp and unyielding. It's time to start repairing the damage. Lieutenant, I expect you to oversee this personally. Ensure there are no further incidents, Luke said firmly. Carter nodded, her throat dry. I'll take care of it. Luke gave a curt nod and turned to leave. But before stepping out, he paused and glanced over his shoulder. One more thing, he said, his voice low and cold. Consider this a warning. The federal government is watching closely. Any further misconduct from this department will not be tolerated. As the door closed behind Luke, the room fell into a heavy silence. Carter felt the weight of the situation pressing down on her, threatening to suffocate her. She knew the road ahead would be fraught with challenges, but she had no choice but to face them head-on. Inside the station, the atmosphere remained tense and somber. The morning's events had ignited a chain reaction that no one had anticipated, leaving everyone waiting anxiously to see what would happen next. News of Daniel Wright's wrongful arrest had spread like wildfire, fueling outrage not just in the local community but across the city. Outside, protests had erupted. Activists, community leaders, and outraged citizens gathered in front of the station, their chants for justice echoing through the streets. In his office, Chief George Baker sat in brooding silence. He knew the department's reputation was teetering on the edge of collapse. The only way to contain the crisis was to issue a public apology. But Baker also understood that a simple apology might not be enough to quell the anger that had been simmering for years. Carter stood at her desk, staring out the window at the growing crowd. The chants for justice, the signs demanding accountability, and the reporters' cameras capturing every angle of the scene were an unmistakable sign. This was more than a protest. It was a reckoning. Baker finally broke the silence, his voice strained but resolute. We'll make the apology, he said, but it needs to come with action. The community isn't going to settle for words anymore. Carter turned to face him, her expression resolute. They shouldn't, she said firmly. This isn't just about this one incident. It's about years of mistrust and abuse. We need to show them that we're serious about change. Baker sighed, his shoulders sagging under the weight of the decision. Then let's get to work, he said. We don't have time to waste. As Carter prepared for what was to come, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The fight for accountability, justice, and change had just begun, and the road ahead would be anything but easy. Chief Baker picked up the phone, his hand trembling slightly as he dialed the public relations team. When the line connected, his voice was deep but steady. I need you to draft a public apology. We'll be addressing the media outside the station this afternoon. Understood, Chief. We'll get on it right away, came the prompt reply. Baker hung up and leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his graying hair. The weight of his past decisions pressed heavily on his shoulders. The times he had turned a blind eye when officers like Jack and Alan crossed the line. He had convinced himself it was part of the job, that compromises were necessary to maintain order. But now, those compromises were coming back to haunt him. A knock on the door pulled Baker from his thoughts. Lieutenant Rachel Carter stood at the threshold, her face tense but resolute. Chief, Daniel Wright is outside with the crowd, she said. Baker nodded, forcing himself to rise. Good. I'll go out and apologize. Carter hesitated, then stepped forward. Chief, I need to tell you something before you go out there. Baker raised an eyebrow. What is it, Carter? She took a deep breath, her eyes unwavering. I've uncovered evidence of systemic corruption within the department. Bribery, cover-ups, racism. This goes far beyond Jack and Alan. It's been happening for years and has been carefully hidden. A chill ran down Baker's spine. You're certain? Carter nodded. I've started collecting evidence with Daniel's help and federal oversight. We can begin cleaning up this mess, but it's going to be a long and difficult process. Baker exhaled heavily, his shoulders sagging under the weight of the revelation. Then we do what needs to be done. It's time to face the consequences of our actions. Carter gave a small nod, a glimmer of empathy in her eyes. I'll support you out there, Chief. We need to show the community that we're serious about change." Baker didn't respond, but his expression spoke volumes. This was no longer about saving face. This was about survival. Together, they walked out of the office and headed toward the station's main entrance. As they approached, the chants of the crowd outside grew louder, voices demanding justice and accountability. Baker's stomach churned with anxiety, but he kept his expression calm as he pushed open the doors and stepped into the sunlight. The crowd fell silent at the sight of him. Cameras clicked rapidly, and reporters thrust microphones forward, shouting questions. Baker ignored them, focusing on the podium that had been set up. In the crowd, he spotted Daniel standing quietly. His face betrayed no emotion, but his presence commanded attention. Baker cleared his throat, stepping up to the podium and adjusting the microphone. He could feel the weight of the crowd's gaze, their judgment hanging in the air. "Good afternoon," he began, his voice low and tense. "First, I want to address what happened this morning. The arrest of Mr. Daniel Wright was a mistake that should never have happened. I take full responsibility for this incident, and I want to offer my deepest apologies to Mr. Wright, his family, and our entire community. I extend my sincerest apologies to Mr. Daniel Wright and to the entire community," Baker said, his voice steady but solemn. The crowd murmured, a wave of skepticism and anger rippling through them. Baker could feel the pressure mounting, decades of mistrust bearing down on him. "We recognize that this incident is just one piece of a much larger problem," Baker continued, his tone growing firmer. "A problem that has persisted for far too long within our police department. I want to make it clear that we are committed to addressing and resolving these issues. Effective immediately, Officers Jack and Allen have been suspended pending an internal investigation. We will conduct a comprehensive review of our practices and procedures, and we will work closely with federal oversight to ensure we meet the highest standards of accountability." Baker paused, scanning the faces in the crowd. He saw anger, doubt, and pain, but also a faint glimmer of hope. "This department has failed you," he admitted, his voice carrying the weight of his words. "We have failed to uphold the trust you placed in us. But I promise you this, we will do better. We will hold ourselves accountable, and we will work tirelessly to rebuild that trust, step by step, day by day." From his position in the crowd, Daniel Wright locked eyes with Baker. His expression remained unreadable, but he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was enough to show that, for now, he was willing to listen. Carter stepped forward, joining Baker at the podium. Her presence, calm yet authoritative, added weight to his words. "As a department, we are not just committed to transparency and justice," she said. "We are committed to action. This will not be an empty promise. The changes start today." The crowd erupted into a mix of cheers and skeptical murmurs. Some held signs aloft, their messages of justice and accountability stark against the backdrop of the police station. Others began to chant again, their voices louder, more insistent. As Baker and Carter stepped down from the podium, the weight of their commitment settled heavily on their shoulders. They knew this was only the beginning. Apologies were not enough to heal years of broken trust, and words alone would not erase the systemic issues entrenched within their department. Inside, Baker returned to his office, his resolve hardening. The fight to reform the department would be long and grueling, but it was a fight they could no longer afford to avoid. Carter lingered by the door, watching the crowd slowly begin to disperse. In her heart, she knew the road ahead would be anything but easy. But for the first time in years, she felt a flicker of hope that real change was possible. The crowd stood silent, their eyes fixed on Chief Baker, though doubt lingered in their expressions, a weariness born of promises unfulfilled. "I know that words alone aren't enough," Baker said, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "We have a long road ahead to rebuild the trust that has been broken. But I want you to know that we are committed to making the necessary changes. We will work with community leaders, activists, and organizations to build a police department that serves and protects everyone, regardless of race or background." He paused, searching for the right words to conclude, But before he could continue, Daniel Wright stepped forward, raising a hand to signal him to stop. "Chief Baker," Daniel began, his voice calm yet firm. "I appreciate the apology, but this isn't just about words. This is about action. True justice demands more than a public statement. It requires real change, real accountability, and real commitment." Baker nodded slowly and stepped back from the microphone, understanding that Daniel was right. An apology was merely the beginning. The real work still lay ahead. Daniel turned to face the crowd, his gaze commanding their full attention. Daniel turned to face the crowd, his gaze commanding their full attention. "We've heard apologies before," he said, his voice resonating through the air. "But what we need now is a commitment to real, lasting change. We need to hold those in power accountable for their actions, and we need to come together to build a system that treats everyone with fairness and respect." The crowd erupted in applause and cheers, their voices rising in unison like a wave. Daniel's words struck a chord, cutting through the anger and frustration that had simmered for so long. "This isn't just about what happened to me," Daniel continued, his tone resolute. "This is about all of us. It's about every person who has been wronged by a system that should have protected them. It's about ensuring that no one else has to endure what I went through. And it's about making justice not just a word, but a reality." The crowd roared in approval, their energy palpable. Daniel paused, letting the moment sink in, the collective hope in their eyes fueling him. "Change doesn't happen overnight," he said, his voice now steady and measured. "It takes time, effort, and cooperation from all of us. But I believe we can make it happen. I believe we can build a better future, not just for ourselves, but for the generations to come." As the applause swelled again, Daniel stepped back from the podium, his message delivered. The crowd's response was overwhelming, a tidal wave of support that filled him with resolve. He knew this was only the beginning of a long and difficult journey, but he was ready to lead the fight for justice, to hold those in power accountable, and to ensure that the voices of the forgotten would finally be heard. As Daniel moved through the crowd, embracing friends and supporters, Lieutenant Rachel Carter stood on the steps of the police station, observing the scene. A mix of relief and determination washed over her. Relief that the immediate crisis had been diffused, but determination to see real change take place. She turned to Chief Baker, who remained near the podium, his expression weary but resolute. "We have a lot of work to do," she said quietly. Baker nodded, his gaze still on the dispersing crowd. "We do, but we'll get through it." As the crowd began to thin, Carter noticed a figure, lingering at the edge of the gathering. A tall man in a sharp black suit stood watching Daniel intently, his expression unreadable yet commanding. A sense of unease prickled at the back of Carter's neck. She stepped closer to the man, her voice calm but firm. "Can I help you with something?" The man turned to face her, his sharp eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made her pause. "I'm here to see Mr. Daniel Wright," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "I have a message for him." Carter frowned, studying the man intently. There was something about him that unsettled her, though she couldn't quite put her finger on it. "Who are you?" she asked. The man gave a faint smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. "Just someone with a vested interest in protecting justice." Before Carter could respond, the man turned away, walking toward Daniel and disappearing into the crowd. Carter watched him go, a deep sense of unease settling in her chest. Whoever he was, she had a strong feeling this wouldn't be the last time their paths crossed. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, shadows stretched long across the police station steps. Carter knew the events of today were only the beginning. The fight for justice was far from over, and the road ahead was fraught with uncertainty. Yet, for the first time in a long while, she felt a glimmer of hope that perhaps they could begin to right the wrongs of the past. At a small community center across town, another pivotal meeting was taking place. Daniel sat at a table surrounded by a diverse group of individuals: community leaders, activists, legal experts, and concerned citizens. They were deep in discussion about the Justice for All initiative, debating strategies and priorities. "We need to focus on education," said Sofia Lopez, a local schoolteacher. "If we want sustainable change, we have to start with the younger generation." "I agree," responded Dr. James Carter, a sociology professor at the City University. "But we can't overlook the immediate needs of those currently suffering under an unjust system. We need a multifaceted approach." Daniel listened carefully, taking notes and asking questions. He was impressed by the passion and expertise in the room. This was exactly what he had envisioned, a collaborative effort drawing strength from the entire community. As the meeting progressed, they began laying out concrete plans. A legal aid clinic would be established to provide free representation for those who couldn't afford it. A community oversight board would be formed to work alongside the police department's internal affairs unit. Educational programs on civic rights, community engagement, and conflict resolution would be developed for schools and community centers. By the end of the meeting, the group felt energized and focused. They knew the road ahead would be long, but they had taken the first steps together. Over time, the city began to see small but meaningful changes. The police department, under the close supervision of Lieutenant Carter and the newly formed oversight board, implemented new training programs emphasizing de-escalation techniques and cultural sensitivity. Officers like Reed, who showed a genuine desire for improvement, were given opportunities to work directly with community leaders and social workers. Meanwhile, the Justice for All initiative quickly gained traction. The legal aid clinic took on dozens of cases, representing individuals who had been wrongfully arrested or mistreated by law enforcement. Educational programs were piloted in several schools, with plans to expand citywide. Perhaps the most significant change was in the city's atmosphere. Residents began to feel more connected, working together to address long-standing issues. Neighborhood watch groups partnered with police to improve safety without resorting to racial profiling. Community forums were held regularly, creating spaces for open dialogue between citizens and local officials. Of course, the journey wasn't without challenges. Missteps still occurred, and moments of tension and mistrust persisted. Change was slow, and opposition arose at every turn. But the difference now was the presence of systems designed to address those issues, hold people accountable, and keep moving forward. 6 months after the events that had set everything into motion, Daniel found himself back at the police station. This time, he wasn't there as a suspect or a victim, but as a partner. He had been invited to speak at a training session for new recruits, sharing his perspective and helping shape the next generation of officers. Standing before the room of fresh faces in crisp uniforms, Daniel took a deep breath. "Change doesn't happen overnight," he began, his voice steady. "It's a process, a collaborative effort that requires accountability, empathy, and an unwavering commitment to justice." The room was silent, the recruits hanging on his every word. As he continued to share his story, his vision, and his hope for the future, Daniel felt a sense of purpose unlike any he had ever known. The journey was far from over, but in that moment, he knew they were heading in the right direction. Together, they were building a foundation for a better, more just world. As Daniel walked through the familiar hallways, he couldn't help but reflect on the changes that had taken place. The atmosphere in the station was markedly different. The usual hustle and bustle remained, but there was a newfound openness in the air. Officers greeted him with respectful nods, and some even paused to shake his hand. Lieutenant Rachel Carter waited for him by the training room door, her warm smile a clear sign of her sincerity. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Wright," she said, extending her hand. "I believe your perspective will be invaluable to these recruits." Daniel shook her hand, noticing the genuine appreciation in her eyes. "I'm happy to be here," he replied, "and please call me Daniel." Stepping into the room, Daniel was met with rows of young faces, their eyes fixed on him. Some looked curious, others cautious. He understood their hesitation. He represented a challenge to the systems they were being trained to uphold. But Daniel wasn't there to criticize. He was there to build bridges, to show them a vision of a future where justice and trust could coexist. Daniel looked out at the young faces before him, brimming with potential yet shadowed by a legacy of mistrust. "Good morning," he began, his voice calm and steady. My name is Daniel Wright, and I'm here to talk about justice. Not just the kind you'll swear to uphold, but the kind that transcends badges and courtrooms, the justice of treating every person with dignity and respect. As Daniel shared his experiences and perspectives, he saw the recruits listening intently. They asked thoughtful questions, engaged in respectful discussions, and seemed genuinely eager to learn how to be better officers. After the session, as Daniel gathered his notes, a young recruit approached him. She looked barely out of high school, with a determined expression that belied her youth. "Mr. Wright," she began hesitantly, "I just wanted to thank you for coming today. I joined the force because I wanted to make a difference, to help people. But after everything that's happened, I started wondering if I made a mistake. Hearing you today reminded me why I'm here." Daniel smiled, moved by her honesty. "What's your name?" he asked. "Emma," she replied. "Emma Brooks." "Emma," Daniel said, his smile warm, "I'm glad you're here. The police force needs people like you. People who want to make a difference, who are willing to ask questions and learn. Don't ever lose that spirit." As Emma walked away, Daniel felt a renewed sense of hope. He realized that recruits like her would determine whether the changes they were fighting for would endure. That evening, Daniel sat in his office at the Justice for All initiative, reviewing case files and reports. The work seemed endless, but it brought him a profound sense of purpose. Each small victory, every life improved, made the long hours and sleepless nights worthwhile. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. Looking up, he saw Sophia Lopez, the teacher who had been instrumental in developing the education programs. "Daniel," she said, her voice brimming with excitement, "I just came from a meeting with the school board. They approved our curriculum for all high schools in the district." Daniel stood, a bright smile spreading across his face. "That's fantastic news. Sophia, your hard work is paying off." Sophia beamed but quickly grew serious. "This is all of our work, Daniel. Without you and what you've been through, this wouldn't have happened." Daniel shook his head. "I may have been the spark, but this movement is so much bigger than me. It's about all of us working together to create the change we want to see." As they discussed the details of implementing the curriculum, Daniel felt a deep sense of fulfillment. This was what real change looked like. Not just protests or speeches, but concrete actions shaping the future of the community. Through small but significant steps, the city began to transform. The police department, under Lieutenant Carter's vigilant leadership and the oversight of the newly formed community board, implemented comprehensive training on de-escalation tactics and cultural sensitivity. Officers like Reed, who genuinely sought to improve, were given opportunities to work alongside community leaders and social workers. The Justice for All initiative became a lifeline for the underserved. Its legal aid clinic took on dozens of cases, representing individuals who had been wrongfully arrested or mistreated by law enforcement. Educational programs flourished in schools and community centers, teaching civic rights, conflict resolution, and community engagement. Perhaps the most noticeable change was in the city's atmosphere. Neighbors worked together to address long-standing issues. Neighborhood watch groups partnered with the police to improve safety without racial profiling. Open forums fostered dialogue between citizens and officials, creating a foundation of mutual respect. Of course, challenges remained. Missteps still occurred, and tensions persisted. Change was slow and met with resistance. But for the first time, systems were in place to address these issues, hold people accountable, and push forward. 6 months after the events that had set everything in motion, Daniel found himself back at the police station. This time, he was neither a suspect nor a victim, but a partner. He had been invited to speak at a training session for new recruits, sharing his story and helping shape the next generation of officers. Standing before the room filled with eager faces, Daniel took a deep breath. "Change doesn't happen overnight," he began, his voice steady. "It's a process, a collaborative effort that requires accountability, empathy, and an unwavering commitment to justice." The recruits sat in rapt attention, absorbing every word. As Daniel continued to share his vision for a more just and equitable future, he felt a sense of purpose stronger than ever. The journey was far from over, but for the first time, he felt confident they were moving in the right direction. Together, building a foundation for a better world. Late that evening, as Daniel finally left his office, he paused on the quiet street outside. The city had settled into its nighttime rhythm, the hum of distant traffic and the occasional rustle of leaves filling the air. He reflected on the changes of the past 6 months and the work still left to be done. Looking up at the star-strewn sky, its brilliance unmarred by clouds, a sense of peace washed over him. They were moving in the right direction. Daniel knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. It would be marked by obstacles and setbacks. But as long as they kept pushing forward, kept working together, they could build the community they all dreamed of. A place where justice wasn't just a word but a living reality for everyone. With renewed determination, Daniel began walking home. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and fresh opportunities to make a difference. And he was ready to face them, one step at a time. Today's story is a poignant reminder of justice, courage, and the power of change. If you were in Daniel's position, would you have the strength to stand up for what's right, even knowing the road ahead would be fraught with challenges? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice could inspire and ignite positive change within the community. If this story resonated with you, share it with friends and family to help spread the message of fairness and determination. Thank you for watching and supporting. Every share can create a ripple effect, taking small but meaningful steps toward building a better world. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss more heartfelt and inspiring stories to come. Wishing you strength, optimism, and success on your journey ahead.